presentation for researchED Durrington Micheal Chiles. The main purpose of my presentation is to share the concept of craft, and this is an approach for how we can really embed our assessment for learning within our practice. And I'm going to explore the different elements of craft over the next sort of 10 to 20 minutes, and how, as practitioners, we can use these elements to really drive forward our approach to assessment in the classroom, but also in terms of how we can promote the use of craft outside of the classroom. And I think, given the current circumstances and the climate of education at the minute, the sort of approach outside the classroom is really important. And if we're going to ensure that our pupils don't develop those knowledge gaps for when we return into the schools and into the classrooms, we really need to focus on how we can drive our remote learning provision forward. And there may be some approaches here today that I share in terms of how we can really promote that sort of development gap not becoming apparent. So in terms of the approach of craft, there are 5 key elements. The first one is about pupils condensing their learning into powerful notes. And the second one is about pupils reflecting, so the R, about becoming reflective learners. The A is about assessment, how we can use assessment both formatively and summatively within the classroom, and also how we can then feed forward in our approach to the F for craft, and then T, how we can embed a target-driven feedback sort of approach to really close any of those knowledge gaps that people may have. Really exciting news at the end of the month, on the 27th of April, craft will be released with John Catt, so keep an eye out. A few updates via my Twitter page. I'm really excited for people to be able to read the book as a whole. Let's start with the first part of craft then, this idea that we want pupils to really condense knowledge into powerful notes. Often we can have scenarios where people will struggle to know where to look when it comes to preparing for an assessment or preparing for an external exam, and often they'll have lots and lots of notes there, and they won't know necessarily where to start. It becomes a bit of a all-consuming sort of approach where they get lost with all these notes that they have. What we want to try and do in that sort of first part of craft is enable our pupils to create the powerful notes that they can then use and apply in preparation for any internal or external assessments that they may have. So the first part of potential strategies is about our explanation and how we set up our explanation to ensure that pupils can take our sort of expertise in terms of the knowledge that we present to them in lessons and really utilise and turn that into powerful notes. I talk about 4 key elements of explanations. I talk about sort of 4 cogs of what I believe are part of our teaching, that idea that we have passion in the way that we teach our subjects, the precision in the way that we deliver it, that actually we cut out those bits that can often be confusing, those bits that will inevitably leave our pupils undecided about what to focus on in terms of creating powerful learning notes to take forward. And then about rehearsal, so we take the time as professionals to rehearse our presentations and our explanations so they're really crisp and sharp. And then that leads to that last cog about delivery, really sharp, focused, precision delivery of our explanations, that we can really help them to focus on what's important for them to really become those sort of expert learners within the subjects that we're teaching. So a number of strategies that I've talked about in terms of helping them to condense learning is developing revision cards, so that they are able to use them to really reflect on concepts and processing subjects. And often they will not really always know how to use the revision cards, and I talk about that later on in sort of the R craft about being reflective learners. But in the first part, it's enabling them to create really useful revision cards, knowing how to use them is important. And often we as teachers don't always necessarily demonstrate it to them, and that can be an important element to ensure that they really get to grips with how to use them. And I think the important bit, keyword on the front, and then the explanation on the back is a sort of good approach for that. Other elements to condensing knowledge could be revision clocks. Revision clocks are widely used now in terms of within the education sector. I've seen lots of examples, and they're really useful ways for pupils to get to grips with what they need to know for different elements of topics. Having them all on one page in summarised notes can really focus on what they need to take forward to apply. And then also about the use of graphic organisers. They can be really powerful as well in terms of helping people to really see sequences and how they form in our subjects. You see the cause and effect and how they link together, and how to compare different elements or different aspects of knowledge that they may be looking at. And this can really help them to organise and aid sort of future recall for long-term memory. Then in terms of the R-craft about being reflective learners, this is the bit that we really want pupils to really practice. I suppose at the minute, supporting to become more self-regulated learners could be important as we move forward in the education system beyond sort of September. And we want them to really reflect. We want them to think deeply or carefully about something. So whatever they're doing, the subject they're doing, we want them to think really clearly about it. And we want them to develop into those reflective learners to enable them to move that sort of knowledge from their short-term to long-term memory. I remember years ago when I first started teaching that discovery-based learning was all the craze, if you like, and whole school CPD was all about how we can set up these sort of carousel activities where they go and discover the different aspects of our subjects. And I think a lot of teachers like myself, we fell into that trap of believing that because there was a buzz in the room, because it looked like they were learning, that they were learning. And when in actual fact, when it came to assessing that knowledge in the form of a quiz or question, there was often a bit of an uncertainty, and they didn't know what it was they'd done, because they'd just remembered about the actual event, but they hadn't remembered about the knowledge that they were learning. And I remember distinctly doing a lesson on tectonics, and they were being little detectives. One student said, "Oh yes, I remember that lesson when we were detectives. Really enjoyed it." But we didn't actually remember the aspects of the different plate tectonic boundaries. And that's where sometimes we can fall into a trap of the difference between students actually learning or students actually doing something. So in terms of developing more reflective learners, so there's a couple of strategies that we could use to develop more reflective learners. This idea of improving that short and long-term memory. So the use of low-stakes space quizzing, retrieval practice and space practice seems to be a very important aspect of our pedagogy in recent years. And in Rosenshine's sort of principles, he talks about how we can aid pupil learning by beginning with a short review of the previous learning, that idea of a daily review and a weekly review, so that it helps pupils to strengthen that previous learning that's taken place, which can lead to a more fluent recall of knowledge over time. And then secondly, this idea of spacing it out, so that it enables them to review that knowledge over a period of time rather than just in one block. So started the quiz, with a quiz, a short, low-stake quiz at the start of lessons, is a good way to help develop students' reflectiveness and enabling them to look at previously taught concepts and processes and really embed those sort of concepts and processes over time. The idea that it's really low stakes, that there's no pressure, no anxiety to it around doing it, and that actually people will see it as that, which will enable that sort of process to be more effective over time. We've done that at our school, and I talk about and shared a few examples from pupils themselves and what they say about it. And I'll just share one example. One girl said that I believe that having a quiz at the start of the lesson allows me to recap knowledge. They allow me to challenge my memory from past lessons and boost my overall knowledge of key facts. Without these short quizzes, I don't think I'll remember as many facts. And it's about the sort of long-term approach to it. It's not a short-term strategy. It's something that needs to be embedded and used over time so that you can really demonstrate the effectiveness that it has on their learning. And that key bit as well about sharing that, the sort of research behind why we do it, it can be helpful with students. Why do we want them to be more reflective learners? And share how by being reflective, by taking time to review the knowledge that they've learned on a regular basis, can really help to strengthen their long-term memory. And by strengthening that long-term memory, they can become more proficient learners and really free up their working memory for more challenging new concepts or processes that they might be exposed to. Another potential example that I've talked about or could use is the idea of the revision cards. And we talked about earlier about how they can create the revision cards, having the key process on the front, having the sort of definition of the concept or the process on the back, and keeping it really simple, but then actually using those revision cards as a reflective tool. And the Lettner system, which was devised by an Austrian called Sebastian Lettner, he talks about how pupils can use those sort of revision cards to really organize that sort of what they know and what they don't know, which is key in terms of being more reflective learners. So the idea that they have 5 boxes, and each box has a different sort of period of time on it. So in the first box, it's every day review. Second box, every 2 days. Box 3 every 5 days. Box 4 every 10 days. And box 5 every 15 days. And they start off in the first box. They have a go, see if they can get it right. If they get it right, they move into the next box. If they get it wrong, they leave it in the same box. And by doing that, they can really focus on what parts of that sort of subject, those concepts or processes, that core knowledge that they need to know that they're still struggling with, and generate that really sort of focused reflection on where to go next. I also talk about this idea of engaging parents, and I think that's really important in the process. How can we ensure that our pupils are more reflective? Well, having that triangulation between home and school will really help to strengthen that reflectiveness. So having a regular engagement activity with home to enable pupils and parents to see where they're going in that learning journey, where they're aiming for, really help to support people to be those more reflective learners. So the second element, or the third element, sorry, which is assessment. This bit is really key, and I think that a lot of work that's been done around assessment really hones in on what we're doing, this idea that we're assessing for learning to really support learning rather than using assessment as a tool for awarding grades or awarding marks, or to use it as an accountability measure within the education system. I think that's really key. I think Harry Fletcher Wood talks about how we should use assessment as a more responsive tool. And as a quote that I really like, this idea that if the purpose for learning is to score well on the test, we've lost sight of the real reason for learning. And there's so much work been done with Dylan Williams as well, and other people about how assessment can be used as a really powerful tool for learning. It depends on how it is being used, and it can have the opposite effect if we use it um, to assess learning in terms of where students are at that point and then not moving on. So, I mean, my view on assessment really changed in recent years, and that point of understanding the difference between formative and summative and how we use those can be really key. And I think also there's been a lot around this idea that we can use assessment to sort of see what sort of grade to award a pupil. So are they on target to achieve a particular expected grade at the end of GCSE? And I think what's happened in recent years in education is there's been a bit of a disconnect between assessing pupils for understanding what grade they're on and actually what we can do to support them to improve them as learners. And I think the problem is that when we use in-school assessment and we determine whether they're on or off track, they're often not the most accurate or reliable way to assess pupils. And maybe actually we should really focus on how we can use assessment for learning in terms of an approach rather than using it as an accountability tool to identify whether pupils have or are achieving their expected grade. So I talk about this idea of how we can really put together a different approach to assessment. And actually, if we invest in some time in designing assessments so that they are effective and efficient, we can really use them as a powerful learning tool. And often assessments in schools are used to sort of encapsulate learning at the end of a topic, or to encapsulate learning at the end of a particular sequence or end of a half term for a data drop. And I think that doesn't necessarily work. So actually, what we can do is actually really design our assessments so that they are cumulative in approach. And by doing that, we can enable pupils to practice concepts and processes from topics over time, rather than just what we would have done in the past, which is testing at the end of a topic. So instead of just testing at the end of that topic, use a cumulative approach to include knowledge from some previous topics. And by doing that, allows them to reflect on previous knowledge, bring that back to mind, and really strengthen that schema. So a potential example to illustrate it is if we've got year 9 pupils learning about the Weimar government, and you have a structured or cumulative approach where they start off looking at the legacy of World War One, Weimar Constitution, the opposition to Weimar, and then they move on and look at and build on that by the next cumulative assessment, having the same knowledge that they covered on that bit, but also then to build on that, looking at the problems of 1923 and the revolts against Weimar, and then the next one, they build on that a bit further and have then the solution from Streisand. So really over time, those sets of assessment build on knowledge, build on that schema, continue to review that knowledge. So at the end of it, it is covering the whole elements of one particular learning sequence. Then in terms of sort of questioning, I mean, that is a key part of assessment as well. Lots of research around questions, so the more we ask questions, the more impact that has in terms of determining where our pupils are at and where they need to go to. And one research study, Morgan and Saxon, claimed that it's better to have a classroom of full of unanswered questions than unanswered answers. And Rosenshine talks about like, the most effective teachers ask lots of questions. So that actually, when we're delivering lessons and we're delivering knowledge, we should spend some time to give pupils the opportunity to ask questions continually, so that we can really assess where they're up to. And again, it's about that low stakes aspect to it. We want pupils to offer questions, and we want them to feel comfortable um, asking those questions and answering questions. And by building that classroom culture, we can really use it as a powerful assessment tool. In terms of the F learner craft, we've got the feed forward approach. So this is this idea where we sort of detach away from, and the F and T, I suppose, are two elements that combine and interrelate and are interwoven together in craft, both through our feed forward and our feedback approach. We really want to use our communication with our pupils in lesson from an activity or from a verbal response as a powerful tool to really move them forward. Often, when we're marking work, we're looking at that piece of work and that pupil, and inevitably there can be some bias in the way that we look at that. However, we really need to see that there's a difference between the performance of the work and the pupil. We should really focus on the performance and not the pupil, because we want to really look at what can we do to help that pupil improve their sort of knowledge, become more expert and more fluent learners in the subject. So I think years ago I was always at a point of taking lots of books home and marking all the time, providing feedback every 2 or 3 weeks, and it become very difficult to keep on top of it. And some of the things that came out of the teacher workload, as a report in 2016, highlighted the excessiveness of quite labour-intensive marking approaches. We really should move away from that. We want to really use marking, or move away from this concept of marking actually, and just talk about it being feedback that helps our pupils to feed forward. And we know from research that actually giving feedback is a really powerful tool, but it's how we're giving that feedback that's more important, and a more of a bigger focus rather than the actual feedback that we give. And there are a couple of elements that I think are important to create an effective feedback culture within our classrooms. So I'd suggest these principles are really key. The idea that it's timely feedback. So we want to be able to give our pupils feedback as quickly as possible. But sometimes it may be necessary that we delay that feedback. It very much depends on what we're feeding back on. That we create a receptive culture. So we want pupils to embrace the feedback, the process of the feedback we give them, and that we want to really give them that like a granular approach to feedback, so a concise and specific target that they can action on. We all know that if we're given feedback as teachers, it can become overwhelming, and often we want to have that sort of short, sharp success from the feedback that we're given. And if we give people too detailed feedback or too much feedback, it can often cause them to switch off. We want the feedback to support that self-regulation that we talked about earlier in the R craft. We want them to really develop reflective learners. And actually, we want to create conditions whereby pupils have that clarity in our feedback to be able to act. They want it to be a fluid process. We want it to be flowing between teacher to teacher and pupil to pupil. And this is why I talk about how often, if we don't have that feedback culture in place where we support them in feeding forward through the feedback that we give them, actually they can reject it. and research shows that that can often be the case. So we want to ensure we create opportunities whereby feedback is enabling them to move forward, to feed forward into the sort of next stage of learning. And Hattie and Timberley summarise some of those sort of key points from the studies that they did. They said that feedback is more effective when it provides information on correct rather than incorrect responses. That the impact of feedback is influenced by the difficulty of the goals and tasks. So often it appears to have more impact when the goals are specific and challenging, but task complexity is low. Praise for task performance appears to be ineffective. So actually giving them praise is often not necessarily the most effective way in improving their sort of knowledge gap. And it appears to be more effective when they are perceived low rather than high effects. And that's what I talk about in terms of creating that culture. So in terms of approaches, so we want the language of our feedback to be positive and enable people to embrace in what we're suggesting for improvements. And as I said, we want it to be razor sharp and not elusive in the language that we use. So some examples in English, when people are writing the essay or writing an essay, the teacher may advise the following. Remember to reference the writer when you're introducing a quote, or support your points by commenting on the connotation of words and images, and then give them an example. Really focusing on that granular element, razor sharp. In geography, when people explain the concept or process, using case study evidence, a teacher might say, when explaining your point, link back to the question set, and then giving them examples of how to do that. Having that relentless approach as well, being consistent, I think is really important. When we've got that established feedback culture in the classroom or in schools, we want to maintain that approach and be consistent in how we apply it. So every subject's unique, and obviously it would be counterproductive to be suggesting there's a one-size-fits-all approach to feedback. But in terms of approaches within subjects, there should be an element of consistency. And we want a situation where teachers and pupils can feel empowered to decide the most effective feedback approaches for their pupils within particular subjects. And once we've got those right conditions, that can go a long way in helping to sort of break down those barriers that pupils have to receiving feedback, and really focus on feeding forward into future learning. Then in terms of sort of delaying the marks, that's another element that's probably really key. We know from that research that if we give them a grade, that's all they're focused on. If we say you've got 80% or that's an A grade, we know that that's not going to be helpful in that feedback. We really want to sort of delay that gratification in terms of marks. Really focus on that feedback on what they need to do to close the gaps and feed forward into the next future learning, and then maybe at some point award or share the number of marks they got or the percentage they got after really focusing on doing the feedback. And then obviously there's this aspect and this discussion about in the moment feedback. So giving them verbal feedback can be really powerful, and doing that within lessons so that it actually means that you can direct and redirect and feed forward into the next task they might be doing, rather than leaving it for a couple of days and never do till the next lesson. So it could be something like, Ryan, can you give me an example of what you mean by that particular aspect you've written? Or they could be doing a particular essay-based activity, and you walk around and you notice that they haven't supported a point that they were making with some facts or several figures or statistics they could use, and redirecting them and supporting them into doing that into the next part of that particular task that they're doing. And then this idea of creating our own error detectives. We want pupils to, as we said, reflect, be self-regulated learners. We want them to be masters of whatever learning journey they're on for their subjects. We want to create a feedback culture whereby they can check their own work prior to submission, so that we can ensure that they are checking that the work is error-free, and often they can pick out those errors quite quickly and make those changes rather than you having to make them during that feedback process. So that your feedback is really focused on the key parts that you want to sort of guide them through to enable them to move forward to the next stage. So that's the key elements of craft, really, in sort of that short space of time. So we've got the C, where it's the condense, we've got the reflect and the R, we've got the assess in the A, and then we've got the feed forward and target driven improvement. By doing that, by having that real focused approach in assessment, we can really use it as a powerful tool for improving knowledge and really creating those sort of expert learners within our subjects. But like I say, if you want to read more and have a bit more of an idea from sort of expert practitioners who are out there in the classroom who share their ideas through the spotlights in the book, then it will be out at the end of the month through John Cat. Hope everyone else has a good day, and hope everyone's weekend is restful following a second week of our sort of remote learning provision with pupils in schools.